If you think power belongs to the man with the badge, you haven't seen what happens when the badge meets the truth. The courtroom felt colder than 60 degrees that morning, the kind of chill that settles into your bones even under bright fluorescent lights. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the prosecution table, posture straight, jaw tight, the silver badge on his chest catching every flicker of light like it deserved to be admired. 10 feet away sat Marcus Reed, wrists resting calmly on the wooden table, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Brooks had already told his version of the story outside, how he spotted Reed near a federal building just after 8 a.m., how he claimed the man looked out of place, how he decided to intervene. He described it with confidence, like it was routine, like it was necessary. Imagine standing there, being measured not by your actions, but by your skin. Imagine knowing that no matter what you say, someone has already decided who you are. Marcus didn't argue when Brooks approached him on the sidewalk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. When the officer questioned why he was there, Marcus answered evenly, saying he had business inside. Brooks smirked, asking what kind of business a man like him could possibly have in a building guarded by armed security and cameras that missed nothing within a 100-yard radius. The air between them thickened. Bystanders slowed down. A few watched from across the street. Brooks asked for ID. Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Brooks barely glanced at it before shaking his head, as if the name alone confirmed his suspicions. "You expect me to believe that?" he muttered. Marcus looked at him carefully then, not angry, not afraid, just certain. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly. It wasn't a threat. It sounded more like a warning wrapped in patience. Brooks interpreted it as defiance. Minutes later, Marcus found himself escorted into a patrol car, not because of violence, not because of chaos, but because someone in authority decided instinct mattered more than evidence. Now, in the courtroom, Brooks recounted the incident with polished certainty, emphasizing how he believed he was protecting the public. Judge Eleanor Whitman listened without expression, her gavel resting inches from her hand. The gallery whispered. Marcus sat still, breathing slow, shoulders relaxed, as if the weight of the room did not belong to him. There was something unsettling about his calm, something that made Brooks speak a little louder, justify a little harder. Because deep down, even before the door at the back of the courtroom began to open, even before two dark-suited figures stepped inside, there was a shift in the air. The kind of shift that happens when the truth is no longer waiting outside, but walking in. The door at the back of the courtroom did not slam. It did not need to, because the quiet click of it closing carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Two men in dark suits stepped inside with the kind of composure that does not ask for attention, yet commands it anyway. Their shoes moved across the polished floor in steady rhythm, measured, deliberate, each step echoing softly through the chamber. Officer Daniel Brooks noticed them first, though he tried not to show it. His shoulders stiffened by half an inch. His voice, once smooth and confident, caught slightly before he cleared his throat and continued speaking. He told the court again how he believed Marcus Reed was acting suspiciously, how he made what he called a reasonable judgment based on behavior and surroundings. He repeated that the area required heightened awareness, that threats could come in unexpected forms. Judge Eleanor Whitman watched him carefully, her expression unreadable, fingers resting near the gavel but not touching it. The two suited men did not sit in the gallery. They walked past the last row of benches and stopped directly behind Marcus. They did not whisper. They did not look around. They simply stood there, hands folded in front of them, eyes forward. The atmosphere shifted in a way that could not be explained in words, only felt in the tightening of lungs and the sudden stillness of shuffling papers. Marcus remained seated, posture straight, breathing slow and even. He did not turn to acknowledge the men behind him. It was as if he had expected them all along. Brooks noticed the detail and felt something unfamiliar press against his confidence. He had dealt with difficult suspects before. He had faced hostility, anger, fear. But this calm unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. Imagine speaking with absolute certainty, only to realize the room is no longer listening the way it was 30 seconds ago. Brooks continued anyway, emphasizing his years on the force, his commitment to public safety, the split-second decisions officers must make. He spoke about responsibility. He spoke about instinct. But instinct now felt smaller under the steady presence standing behind the defendant. One of the suited men finally stepped forward, not hurried, not aggressive, simply precise. He approached the clerk and handed over a slim leather folder. No dramatic gestures, no loud declarations, just paper sliding against wood. Judge Whitman accepted the folder and opened it slowly. Her eyes moved left to right, once, then again, as if confirming what she was reading. The faintest change crossed her face, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition. She looked up, not at Brooks, but at Marcus. The silence stretched longer than a full minute, long enough for every person in the room to feel the weight of it settle onto their shoulders. Brooks shifted his stance, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling heavier than steel. He had believed he was presenting a simple case. He had believed he understood exactly who sat at that table. But as Judge Whitman drew in a measured breath and prepared to speak, the foundation beneath that belief began to crack, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet certainty of truth stepping into the light. Judge Eleanor Whitman lowered the folder slowly onto the bench as if the paper itself carried weight. The sound it made against the wood was soft, but in the silence it echoed like a decision already forming. She looked directly at Marcus Reed, her eyes no longer distant, no longer neutral, but focused with unmistakable clarity. Then she turned toward Officer Daniel Brooks. The shift in her gaze felt like a spotlight moving across a dark stage. "Officer Brooks," she said carefully, every syllable measured. "Are you aware of the full identity of the man you detained this morning?" The question did not accuse. It invited truth. Brooks swallowed, his confidence searching for stable ground. "Your Honor," the defendant identified himself as Marcus Reed. "I verified his name." His voice sounded thinner now, stretched tight. Judge Whitman lifted the document slightly. "Director Marcus Reed," she replied, allowing the title to settle into the air. The two suited men behind Marcus remained still, but their presence now carried unmistakable authority. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a single lift of the judge's hand. Brooks blinked, as if the word director had not fully registered. "Director of what?" he asked before he could stop himself. The judge's expression did not change. "Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words did not explode. They did not need to. They moved through the room with steady force, rearranging every assumption that had existed moments before. Imagine believing you had complete control of a situation, only to realize the person you underestimated oversees thousands of agents across 50 states. Imagine discovering that the man you questioned within 10 feet of a federal building was the highest authority inside it. Brooks felt heat rise beneath his collar despite the cool air. The badge on his chest no longer gleamed. It felt exposed. Marcus finally stood, not abruptly, not defiantly, but with quiet composure. His hands rested calmly at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was even, almost reflective. "I was scheduled to review a security assessment at 8:30 this morning," he said. "Instead, I was detained for appearing suspicious." There was no anger in his tone. That absence carried more power than outrage ever could. Judge Whitman looked back at the folder. Documentation confirms Director Reed's credentials, appointment, and clearance level. She paused. "Officer Brooks, did you at any point confirm the identification presented to you?" Brooks hesitated. He had glanced at the card. He had seen the seal, but he had trusted his instinct more than the evidence in his hand. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward to listen. Marcus did not glare at him. He did not demand apology. He simply held eye contact, steady and unwavering. In that gaze was not revenge, but accountability. The realization settled slowly across Brooks' face. This was no longer about a routine stop. It was about judgment, about perception, about the invisible lines people draw without realizing how easily they can be erased. The law he believed he represented had been sitting quietly before him, patient, observant, and fully aware. And now the room waited to see what justice would do next. Silence did not break after the revelation, it deepened. Judge Eleanor Whitman folded her hands and studied the room as if weighing more than a single incident. Officer Daniel Brooks stood motionless, the certainty he had carried only minutes earlier dissolving into something far more fragile. Director Marcus Reed remained composed, shoulders squared, eyes steady, not triumphant, not hostile, simply present. The two federal agents behind him did not move, yet their stillness spoke clearly. The balance of authority had shifted without a single raised voice. "This court is not concerned with titles," Judge Whitman said carefully, her tone firm but controlled. "It is concerned with conduct." The words hung in the air like a quiet warning. She turned to Brooks. "You stated that you acted on instinct. Explain to this court why documented federal identification was not sufficient to verify his position." Brooks felt every eye in the room settle on him. He opened his mouth, then paused. Instinct had sounded reasonable before. Now it sounded thin. "Your Honor, I believe the identification could have been fabricated," he answered, though the confidence behind the statement was gone. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not shake his head. He simply listened. That calm presence made Brooks aware of something he had not considered before, that authority is not proven by volume, but by restraint. Judge Whitman glanced again at the folder. "The identification presented contained multiple authentication markers," she said. "Markers that are designed specifically to prevent doubt." The implication was clear. Brooks had not truly doubted the identification. He had doubted the man holding it. A faint shift moved across his expression as the realization settled in. Imagine recognizing, in real time, that the decision you justified as caution was influenced by something deeper, something unspoken. Marcus finally stepped forward half a pace, not to confront, but to clarify. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "this is not about my position. It is about perception. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone who does not fit an expectation." His words were steady, almost reflective, and they carried no bitterness. The courtroom absorbed them slowly. Brooks lowered his gaze for the first time since taking the stand. The badge on his uniform no longer felt like proof of righteousness. It felt like a responsibility he had misjudged. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. "Officer Brooks, authority demands discipline. Discipline requires evidence, not assumption." Her voice was calm, but firm enough to leave no ambiguity. The federal agents remained silent, allowing the institution they represented to speak through process rather than intimidation. In that moment, the room understood something profound. This was not about punishing a mistake. It was about confronting a pattern. Brooks inhaled, the breath heavier than it should have been. He had entered the courtroom certain he was defending his actions. Now he stood at the center of a lesson far larger than himself. Marcus met his eyes again, not with anger, but with expectation. Not revenge. Accountability. The law had not raised its voice. It had simply revealed itself. And under that steady light, excuses began to fade. The weight of the moment did not explode into chaos. It settled like a verdict already forming in the conscience of the room. Officer Daniel Brooks stood with his hands at his sides, no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but uncertain. The silence pressed against him harder than any accusation could have. Judge Eleanor Whitman allowed that silence to linger, because sometimes the most powerful reckoning begins when there is nothing left to argue. Director Marcus Reed remained steady, his expression calm, but there was something deeper in his eyes now, not satisfaction, not anger, but resolve. "This courtroom represents more than procedure," Judge Whitman said evenly. "It represents trust." Her words carried across the wooden benches and settled into every corner of the chamber. Brooks swallowed, feeling the shift from justification to reflection. He had repeated the word instinct more than once. Now instinct sounded like an excuse he had borrowed from himself. Marcus spoke again, his voice controlled and deliberate. "Your Honor, I do not stand here asking for special treatment. I stand here asking for equal treatment." The sentence was simple, but it struck with quiet force. Imagine serving your country for decades, overseeing operations that protect millions, and still being reduced to suspicion within seconds. Imagine earning authority measured in miles of responsibility and being judged within a space of 10 feet. Brooks lifted his eyes slowly to meet Marcus. For the first time, he did not see a defendant. He saw a man who had chosen restraint over humiliation. That realization unsettled him more than any reprimand could. Judge Whitman nodded slightly. "The court will be referring this matter for internal review," she stated. "Authority must be exercised with discernment, not assumption." There was no anger in her tone, only clarity. Brooks felt the meaning behind those words settle into his chest. Internal review meant scrutiny. It meant questions. It meant confronting not only what he did, but why he did it. The badge on his uniform suddenly felt less like protection and more like responsibility he had not fully understood. The federal agents remained silent, allowing the process to unfold without interference. Marcus turned slightly toward Brooks, his voice lower now, meant not just for the courtroom, but for the man who had detained him. Power is not proven by control, he said quietly. It is proven by fairness. There was no threat in the statement, only truth. Brooks drew a slow breath. In that breath was the beginning of something uncomfortable but necessary. The realization that instinct without reflection can become bias. That confidence without evidence can become injustice. Judge Whitman lifted the gavel, not to punish, but to close the immediate proceeding. The sound it made was firm and final. The courtroom began to stir, but the lesson remained suspended in the air. Brooks did not move right away. He stood there, absorbing the weight of what had unfolded. The man he had doubted had chosen dignity over retaliation. The system he believed he represented had corrected him without shouting. And in that quiet correction was a truth that would follow him long after he walked out of that room. The law does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the fairest one. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of what had happened did not leave with the crowd. Officer Daniel Brooks walked toward the exit with measured steps, each one heavier than the last. Conversations whispered behind him, not loud enough to accuse, yet clear enough to remind him that reputation can shift in less than a minute. The badge on his chest no longer felt like armor. It felt like a mirror. Director Marcus Reed remained near the front for a brief moment, speaking quietly with the two federal agents who had stood behind him. There was no celebration in his posture, no trace of victory. Only composure. Only purpose. Imagine carrying authority over thousands of agents across 50 states and still choosing restraint when disrespected. That choice was not weakness. It was discipline refined over decades. Brooks paused near the courtroom doors. For the first time that morning, he looked back. Marcus was thanking the judge with a slight nod, his voice low, respectful. The room that had once viewed him as a defendant now regarded him with a different understanding. Judge Eleanor Whitman gathered her documents carefully, aware that this moment would travel far beyond these wooden walls. Internal review would begin before the end of the day. Procedures would be examined. Decisions would be questioned, not for revenge, but for accountability. Brooks felt the beginning of that process like a distant storm, not yet visible, but inevitable. He replayed the sidewalk encounter in his mind. The early morning light. The federal building standing tall behind Marcus. The identification card placed in his hand. He remembered glancing at it. He remembered dismissing it. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because his assumption felt clearer. That realization settled into him with uncomfortable honesty. Marcus stepped toward the aisle, passing within a few feet of Brooks. For a brief second, they stood face to face without an audience. No judge, no agents, no spectators. Just two men separated by decisions made in under a minute. Brooks expected condemnation. Instead, Marcus spoke calmly. Every officer carries more than a badge, he said. They carry trust. Protect it. There was no anger in his tone, only gravity. Brooks nodded slightly, unable to respond with the certainty he once had. The hallway outside felt brighter, almost stark, as if the world itself had sharpened its focus. Staff members moved past them, their footsteps echoing across polished floors. Life continued, indifferent yet changed. Marcus walked toward the exit with steady confidence, the agents following at a respectful distance. Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, absorbing the lesson that had unfolded without shouting, without spectacle. Authority had not been stripped from him by force. It had been questioned by truth. And truth, he realized, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. As Marcus stepped into the daylight beyond the courthouse doors, the morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the federal building across the street. It stood less than 100 yards away, solid and unshaken. Brooks watched him go, understanding now that justice is not a title, not a uniform, not a reflex. It is a discipline. And on this day, discipline had quietly rewritten the balance of power. News travels fast when power shifts quietly. By late afternoon, the story had already moved beyond the courthouse walls. Not as a headline filled with outrage, but as a discussion whispered through department hallways and federal offices alike. Officer Daniel Brooks sat alone in the precinct briefing room, the overhead lights humming softly above him. His uniform was still pressed, his badge still polished, yet something fundamental had changed. The internal review notice had arrived in formal language, precise and measured, requesting documentation, body camera footage, written statements. Procedure. Accountability. Across town, inside the federal building less than 100 yards from where the morning encounter began, Director Marcus Reed stood at the head of a long conference table. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel. Senior agents listened as he addressed them, his voice steady and controlled. Authority is tested when it is challenged, he said, but it is defined when it is exercised fairly. There was no mention of humiliation, no demand for retaliation, only a reaffirmation of standards. Imagine having the power to dismantle someone's career with a single call and choosing instead to reinforce the system that protects everyone. That choice carried weight. Back at the precinct, Brooks replayed the sidewalk moment again. 8:15 in the morning. Crisp air. The federal building rising nearly 200 feet behind Marcus. The identification card in his hand. The question he asked. The doubt he chose. He realized something uncomfortable. He had not been protecting the public from a threat. He had been protecting his own assumption from being questioned. That awareness did not feel dramatic. It felt heavy. A senior captain entered the room quietly and placed a hand on the table. This is bigger than paperwork, the captain said. It is about perception. Learn from it. Brooks nodded slowly. There was no anger in the captain's tone, only expectation. Outside, the city moved forward, cars streaming down the avenue, pedestrians crossing under traffic lights that changed every 60 seconds without bias. Systems function best when they operate without prejudice. Inside the federal office, Marcus concluded his briefing with a final thought. We do not wear authority to elevate ourselves, he said. We wear it to elevate trust. The agents rose, understanding that the lesson extended beyond one incident. As evening approached, the courthouse steps where everything shifted stood quiet under the fading light. The building had witnessed arguments before. It had witnessed confessions, defenses, and verdicts. But today it had witnessed something subtler. A correction without cruelty. A confrontation without violence. Brooks stepped outside the precinct just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement. He looked at his badge once more, not with pride alone, but with reflection. He understood now that justice does not belong to instinct unchecked. It belongs to discipline examined. And somewhere across the city, a director who had every reason to retaliate chose instead to remind the system what fairness truly means. In that choice, the balance of power was not destroyed. It was restored. The review board convened 3 days later in a quiet conference room inside the precinct. Not a courtroom this time, but the atmosphere carried the same weight. Officer Daniel Brooks sat at one end of a long oak table, his uniform immaculate, his expression measured. Across from him were senior supervisors, legal advisors, and a representative from internal affairs. A screen displayed the body camera footage from that morning. 8:15 a.m., clear skies. The federal building rising tall in the background. The moment Marcus Reed handed over his identification played again in real time. No dramatic music. No raised voices. Just a choice unfolding second by second. Pause it there, one supervisor said calmly as the image froze on the identification card in Brooks' hand. The federal seal was visible. The authentication markers clear. Brooks watched himself hesitate for half a second before lowering the card. That half second now felt longer than a mile. What did you see in that moment? The supervisor asked. The question was not hostile. It was direct. Brooks inhaled slowly. I saw a possibility of deception, he answered at first, but even as he spoke, he heard the weakness in it. He looked at the screen again. I also saw something I did not expect, he admitted. The room remained silent, allowing him to continue. And I reacted to that expectation instead of the evidence. Across town, Director Marcus Reed was briefed on the progress of the review. He listened without expression, hands folded on the table. He did not ask for discipline. He did not suggest consequences. He asked only one question. What corrective measures are being implemented? That question shifted the focus from punishment to prevention. Back in the review room, policies were discussed. Additional bias training. Clearer verification protocols. Mandatory pauses before escalation. Not as public theater, but as structural reinforcement. Brooks felt something unfamiliar but necessary take root inside him. Accountability did not feel like humiliation. It felt like exposure to light. Imagine realizing that the uniform you wear amplifies every assumption you carry. Imagine understanding that the difference between protection and prejudice can exist within a single unexamined thought. By the end of the session, formal recommendations were drafted. Brooks would undergo retraining and temporary reassignment pending completion. It was not the end of his career. It was the beginning of scrutiny. He signed the documents with steady hands. Outside, late afternoon sunlight filtered through the precinct windows, casting long lines across the floor. At the federal building, Marcus concluded another meeting, unaware of the exact wording of the review but confident in the direction it was taking. He had not sought to dismantle a man. He had sought to strengthen a system. As Brooks stepped out of the conference room, he paused beside a framed oath on the wall, the words about justice and equality printed in bold script. He had read them dozens of times before. Today, he read them differently. Authority had confronted him without anger. Truth had corrected him without cruelty. And in that correction was something stronger than fear. It was responsibility rediscovered. 1 week later, the city had already moved on, but the lesson had not. Officer Daniel Brooks stood once again beneath the morning sky, the federal building visible less than 100 yards away, its glass reflecting the early sunlight with quiet steadiness. He was not there on patrol. He was there for retraining, part of a new protocol session conducted jointly with federal liaisons. The same sidewalk where everything began now felt different, not because the concrete had changed, but because he had. Inside a conference room overlooking the street, Director Marcus Reed addressed a small group of officers and supervisors. His presence was calm, deliberate, grounded. Accountability is not about punishment, he said evenly. It is about alignment. Alignment between authority and fairness. Brooks listened from the second row, posture straight, eyes forward. The words did not feel like criticism. They felt like instruction. Imagine being given the chance to confront your own assumptions before they define you permanently. Imagine being corrected by the very system you pledged to protect, not through humiliation, but through expectation. Marcus continued, speaking not as a victim of the incident, but as a guardian of institutional integrity. Every decision you make carries weight. He said, sometimes that weight is measured in seconds. Sometimes it is measured in trust. Brooks thought about that half-second pause captured on camera, the glance at identification, the dismissal, a moment small enough to overlook, large enough to alter a reputation. When the session concluded, officers filed out quietly, conversations subdued but thoughtful. Brooks hesitated, then approached Marcus directly. There were no cameras now, no courtroom, no supervisors listening, just two men standing within arm's length. Sir, Brooks began, his voice steady but sincere. I made a decision based on assumption. I am working to correct that. Marcus studied him for a brief moment, not searching for weakness, but for honesty. Growth begins where certainty ends, Marcus replied. Do not waste the lesson. There was no extended handshake, no dramatic reconciliation. Only mutual understanding that the work ahead mattered more than the incident behind them. Outside, traffic flowed steadily, engines humming, pedestrians crossing streets in measured patterns. Systems functioning. Trust rebuilding. Brooks stepped back onto the sidewalk, sunlight warming the pavement beneath his boots. The badge on his uniform still carried authority, but now it carried awareness as well. Across the glass facade of the building, his reflection appeared smaller than before, not diminished, but grounded. The power he once believed came automatically with the title had been redefined. It was no longer about control. It was about discipline. Marcus watched from the window for a brief moment before turning away to continue his duties. He did not need public vindication. The correction had already taken place. And as Brooks walked toward his patrol car, he understood something that would follow him for the rest of his career. Authority can command attention, but only fairness can command respect. He once thought he represented the law. Now he understood that the law represents something greater than him. And when power forgets that truth, justice does not shout. It simply steps forward, steady and unshaken.